Now, if you're wondering how I knew what size to make these divs to make them fill this space so perfectly, I'm afraid that comes back down to a little bit of math. So let's start by looking at the top of the page. Remember, we have a graphic here, and we can't really select it because in this template, this region is locked. But this graphic is 780 pixels wide, and the container div that surrounds all of the content on this page is 780 pixels wide. So I knew that's how much space I had to work with in total. And I knew that I wanted to have a similar amount of space between the left and the right sides of the page, and a margin down the middle that was also similar. So I decided that I would put 10 pixels in each of those three places. So right away I lost 30 pixels of space. Then I continued to calculate, deciding that I wanted the story to be a little bit more narrow than the sidebar, because in this particular case, the content of the sidebar is much longer than the content of the story. The way it's come out, the story goes down a little lower than the sidebar. But I'll play around with line spacing, and I've decided it's okay for those columns to not be perfectly lined up. That is a challenge anytime you use CSS to have two columns that are exactly the same length. There are some tricks using background images, but for now, let's just assume it's okay that these aren't exactly the same height as one another, but that they come pretty close because of the way I've sized the width of each of these divs. So let me close the Files panel. And let's study these two for a moment. My story div is 330 pixels wide, except as we learned at the beginning of this lesson, if we have 10 pixels of padding, then it's really 350 pixels wide. And if on top of that, we have 10 plus 5 pixels of margin, then we're really looking at a total width for the sidebar of 365 pixels. Yes, you're allowed to use a calculator for this. And yes, I strongly encourage notes and diagrams and whatever helps you visualize the way you divide up a page like this. Just to help crystallize it, let's look at the sidebar for a moment. Here we have a 380 pixel wide sidebar, plus 20 pixels of padding gives us 400, plus 15 pixels of margin, so we're at 415. 415 plus 365 equals 780. And we have a perfectly laid out page. Now there is a caveat. If I were looking at this in IE5, this margin would be bigger down the middle because IE5 wouldn't be adding those 10 pixels of padding to the total width of my two divs. If you can live with that, then this design should work just fine, even in IE5. But I also want you to notice that as you're creating divs like this and as you're getting them lined up, if you're off even a little bit, let's say you were off by 5 pixels. This is what happens. Whoa, where'd that div go? If I scroll down, you see that it was forced down below the end of the first div because it's too wide now to fit next to that div. So this kind of thing can be crazy making when you first start creating CSS layouts, because unless you get the spacing exactly right, you'll either have a big gap between your divs or you'll have one bumped down beside the other. So let me put that back to 380. Just click anywhere for that to be saved. And you see, now I have my divs side by side again. This is also the kind of challenge you can have with different browsers. If an older browser comes along that calculates the margin and padding differently, and there are differences among different browsers besides IE5, then you can end up with a display where one div is way down below the other. And that can lead to very unpredictable and very unflattering results in your page designs. And that concludes the math portion of this lesson. And for those of you who thought you were avoiding math by going to design school, I'm really sorry. You can just try and do this visually, but I strongly recommend you at least consider using a calculator and a little bit of planning when you're trying to set up a layout like this.